So making sure that we're giving as much community development support as we can to kind of existing community groups and organisations as we're thinking about how on earth do they continue to deliver any activities, or what compelled to deliver a response to the COVID crisis, including a lot of new social action. So mutual aid has become a term we're all really familiar with now. So kind of supporting new people who have come together to help their neighbours on that really informal level and thinking about what kind of support do they need. Clearly, a big job for us has been around investment and around funding. And that's our mantra, isn't it? All the time is about thinking about how do we, as an equal partner in the public service and the community response, how do we make sure that we have enough investment to do that? So we've done a lot of lobbying nationally, regionally and locally. We're continuing to work now really closer with the National Lottery Fund. So as a lot of you are aware, the headline 750 million from government was funneled in a number of different ways. One of those ways was through the National Lottery. So we've been working really closely with our colleagues, both regionally and locally at the Lottery, to try and make sure that we can access our fair share, the right proportionate amount from Oldham groups and organisations. And that continues to be a challenging piece of work, but we're changing the way in which we do things to have a better relationship. We're influencing the Lottery to make sure that they're understanding some of the local issues, rather than decisions being taken kind of more regionally or across regions. And we think that is starting to make sure that we're getting more of that investment through to Oldham groups. We've changed the way in which we provide that support around applications for funding. So, we've set up kind of funding bid mentor program, just trying to give as much practical support to groups to apply for that funding so you can get on and do the amazing response that you're doing. And then I think just kind of thinking about investment locally as well, we looked at, well, what have we got available locally? We've got the Action Oldham Fund. So we released some of that right in the first week, and we've fundraised alongside that. So we put £20,000 up from the Action Oldham Fund, and we've managed to attract nearly £30,000 from local business and through just members of the public through Just Giving. And we've managed to award £40,500 of that in 49 small grants over the last 8 weeks. And hopefully a number of you in the room have received some of that and have had, small grants, yes, not longer term. How are we going to be here beyond the next few months funding, but just that kind of funding up front to help you do that response. Debbie, you mentioned volunteering. Obviously, volunteering is really important for us at Action Together with the Accredited Volunteer Centre. We, before the kind of NHS Responder programme was up and running, we weren't sure what that was going to look like. We put a shout out locally, set up our own local emergency response volunteering. Across Action Together, we've had 900 people across the 3 boroughs sign up to want to help, and actually 500 of those, so way over half of those specifically were for Oldham. I'm really pleased to say we've got 300 new people volunteering as part of that emergency response and active every week, either through the food distribution centres, or we're now brokering some of those volunteers and that volunteer capacity to existing community groups and organisations. So shout out if you do need support around volunteering, please let us know. We've got people who desperately want to help. And I think then the last thing really just to mention is around kind of that partnerships and collaboration work that we do. So we know our name Action Together is because we know we can't do things if we're not working together. We don't have anywhere near the same impact if we're not doing that together. So, we've been working really closely with the local authority, with Rebecca's team around co-leading some of that emergency response. But equally, we've then been wrapping around and working with everybody here and others who aren't here from the sector, doing a really big piece of work with Oldham Food Bank to make sure that small group of volunteers have been able to provide emergency food to nearly 5,500 people since this time. But there's loads of other organisations providing that real emergency response, food response, and others that aren't part of that. So looking at how do we work in partnership to strengthen that. And then I guess the last thing I just want to touch on is some of the work that we're doing with you all around some of the equalities impact. So we know that what COVID and the experience of COVID hasn't created new inequalities, but what it has done is shone a big light on the inequalities that were there. And we believe that it's really important that we understand the insight from people living in our communities who have been detrimentally impacted, not just by COVID actually, but by poverty and those other issues, and work with community groups and organisations who understand and know those people, so that we can use that insight, but really importantly, that we can work together to plan and deliver a response that mitigates as much of those impacts as possible. And that's been a really key, important piece of work for us in this time. Okay, thank you.
That's unbelievable, Laura. Thank you so much for that. You can't help but be impressed at just how much ground has been covered. I think also we do recognise that as much as people on the call have gone above and beyond to make sure that Oldham is supported, there's no doubt that you've all had your individual pressures and stresses to deal with as well, trying to keep the organisations afloat, trying to make sure that staff can be paid, the bills are paid. And we do appreciate that you've done amazing work, but in the context of that very difficult situation. I think we do need to think about how we plan for the restart and the recovery, because I think in Oldham we're going to feel the impact much harder. I think the recovery is going to take much longer, and we just need to make sure that we are coordinated, and myself and Debbie can make representations to government about what a social recovery programme looks like in terms of getting people back to work. When I see the unemployment figures coming out since COVID started, genuinely I'm fearful for what might well follow, particularly if we have a second spike and a recession turns into a depression. I mean, that's really does fill me with dread. And I think we can work together to plan that. So we're going to go straight into questions. We've had two pre-submitted from Rebecca Marshall and Yvonne Lee. So Rebecca, can I ask you to come in first? And then, as I say, if you're interested in asking a question or making an observation, if you just add your name into the chat, please. Rebecca.
Hiya, Jim. I've not got it up on my screen what I asked you, so just bear with me.
I've got the question here, Rebecca, about your funding for your school holiday programmes comes from local councillors, and obviously with the social distancing, with the restrictions that are in place, you're just concerned about what that means in the future, and also just to get an idea of when will lockdown be eased to the point of which you can begin to...
Yeah, I think with the councils in particular, with any council money that we get, we never have a contract or a service level agreement. That's never happened. So obviously now it's a question, what happens with that money that's been put in our bank account already for activities that had to be cancelled? Is it we credit that? Is it the council write it off and help us out that way? Because obviously staff wages are currently at a standstill, we're all on furlough. And I want that to be hopefully a consistent approach across the borough and not each councillor making their own decision of what happens with that money. I think that will be really helpful for us to move forward and to work through that. And then I know it's a case of a lot of it's not knowing what's going to happen for the future. But when we are allowed to operate, can we access support and training in how we operate safely on a local level? We don't have the big infrastructure in place for chemicals, for cleaning, for everything else. And a lot of the buildings we use are not our buildings. So how do we work through all that? So any support in that would be much appreciated.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Yvonne, do you want to come? Hi, Yvonne, are you there?
I can't see her on the call actually, unless I'm.
I can see Yvonne on the call, and I can see that she's unmuted, but I just can't hear any sound coming from.
Who is it you're looking for?
Yvonne Lee.
Yvonne Lee. No, she's not here, is she?
She's gone for a brew, I think.
Okay, that's fine. Jean Hurlston, do you want to come in?
Hi, yeah, my comment was just was an observation. that Street Angels, we've continued to function throughout the lockdown period. Most of our rough sleepers were actually taken into accommodation in hotels in Manchester. That was great. We've had a doubling now of people on a Saturday night and on a Wednesday afternoon when we're open. So we're getting now about 30, 40 people who are turning up, who are actually new to us. And some of them are saying that they've just had no money, or lockdown has increased the friction within the home, and they can't stay in the home. So we're actually thinking that our work is extending and developing, and what is needed in addition to the food handouts and the clothing handouts that we're doing is that emotional support, and actually we work best when we work collaboratively. So if we've got advisors with us on the spot, it really helps. So we want to do more partnership work with others who can help directly with housing issues and also with mental health issues.
Thank you, Jean. I have got Yvonne's questions that she submitted, and I think a number of these may well be important across the board. So I'll go through them, and if Yvonne joins the call and recognises one of her questions, she may well just chip in. I think the first one, which has been a common theme, and I can see Lisa's mentioned it in the chat as well, is around the provision of PPE. And I think certainly in the early days, there definitely was a concern about how that was being distributed and whether it was really getting to those who were at risk. So I know, I don't know how kind of open Rebecca wants to be, but there's definitely a massive concern with the council whereby the NHS were being given priority access from the national supply. So when the army distributed what was the kind of EU no deal stock that was being stockpiled, that was distributed via the army to the NHS, and I think many local councils were really struggling to get hold of their part of it, and that's why you're seeing, I think, the gaps in care homes. But obviously, as we begin to unlock, and we're asking people to kind of get back to a sense of normality, that's got to be done in a safe way. And I don't know if people have just been around trying to buy PPE. I think it's definitely more available, but there's no doubt that the price of it is just extortionate. You know, the face masks, the gloves, the alcohol gel is far more expensive now because demand has gone through the roof. And so it'd be good to get a sense from the council about what support can be offered and whether or not they feel across Greater Manchester with the additional stock that's been purchased, whether there may well be some surplus in the short term that can be distributed to the wider third sector groups in Oldham. Rebecca, are you okay to take the PP question along with Rebecca's question about local council funding and how to operate safer? And then I think Jean, point around, and Laura may well want to come in on this as well, the kind of the social impact of COVID beyond the homeless stuff, but actually the emotional well-being, the stress that it's bringing on families and households in particular. Rebecca.
Yeah, so I'll answer what I can of the questions that people have posed. Some of it will be things that I'll need to kind of get more detail to help with and probably do some more work. So in terms of Rebecca's question around funding, in terms of any funding that was allocated from districts in the last financial year, that funding is still available to councillors, and that commitment has been maintained. In terms of the working through the detail of what payment will be given and what the specifics were about what it was agreed would be offered, we'd have to work that through on a case-by-case basis, but that is based on an underpinning principle that the funding is there from the last financial year. So I'm not sure what that funding exactly relates to, so it'd be useful to understand the specifics perhaps offline. But your point about consistency is something that I've made a note of, because I think that is a really good point, that what we absolutely need to do is strive for consistency in the application of that principle. In terms of the request for advice and support about safe practice and social distancing, that is definitely something we can support with. So that's perhaps something I'll pick up in discussion with Laura about how we can feed that through and support people as we transition out of lockdown. Just in response to Jean's comment about the longer term response, that is absolutely key, Jean. I think when we were in lockdown and we were in crisis response, in some ways, knowing what all of our role was and how we responded to it was easier. The hard challenges, and now as we transition out of lockdown, we start to understand what the longer term implications are financially. That's where our really difficult conversations need to take place, and that's where the partnership and the collaboration is key, because the answers to that are less straightforward now. We're moving into a different phase. In terms of Lisa's specific question around PPE, that's really not about the availability. It's about your role, Lisa, I think, as a small business who want to help with the supply of PPE. Now, that is something that I am really keen that we work with you as far as we can to unpick, because we do recognise that there's a new demand for PPE that will be maintained for the kind of short to medium term, which is a real opportunity for social enterprises and small local businesses to benefit economically from that new demand. So any kind of system conditions or blockages that are getting in the way of enabling you to do that, whilst I can't promise we can solve it, what I can say is that we will want to work with you to do that. So I don't know if someone has got contact details for people on the call. If Lisa could, my email address could be shared with Lisa, and perhaps I can pursue a conversation with you around that. And then finally, I know there are some questions about differential impact on South Asian, but also BAME population more generally, of COVID and of other things. That is something absolutely that we recognise. We are in the process of getting the data collated that gives us an understanding of how that relates to Oldham. So whilst the data is available nationally, and we have some high level data that is available for the impact of Oldham, actually in terms of understanding exactly what that impact is locally, it isn't something that we can just kind of reach into and get, and we're having to do a piece of analysis. But it is vital that we do that in order that that can inform our preventative response and our targeted approach right across the board in Oldham. But regardless of that, and I've had conversations already with a number of people on the call about this, we do recognise that there is a high level of anxiety, in some cases distrust amongst communities that people are feeling at this time. And for example, we have got a comprehensive engagement meeting tomorrow with members of various groups who represent people with protected characteristics. So we really need to listen, understand right across the system about how people are feeling, but again, work together collaboratively to kind of reassure where necessary, respond differently where necessary. But the answers to this are not easy. It's a really complex issue with very many factors, often related to deprivation as well as to race, that we need to work together in partnership to address. From my perspective, what I can say is that we are working as quickly as we can and as far as we are able to understand that impact and to work in partnership with all of you and with other people to respond to that as effectively as possible. And I'm, really want to listen, and this event tomorrow is part of that, to the impact that it is having upon people.
Thank you, Rebecca. Laura, and then Debbie, can you come in, please?
Thanks, Jim. I think to answer Rebecca's question, Rebecca Marshall, the ask around support around when it's safe to do so, and when we need to start, as we're coming through transition and thinking about how do we deliver activities again, how do we do what we do. You know, one thing that we've started to do some planning for Action together across the team is trying to think about what we think the key things are around where people will need additional support and or training and or advice, and how can we connect up with the kind of experts in the field, if you like, to provide some of that. So the first thing we've been working on is some training webinars around how to open buildings safely. Obviously, we're still waiting for the government advice on some of that, but taking a look at some of the retail and the opening shops advice, and that's particularly pertinent for people here who are trying to reopen their charity shops, for example. You know, looking at some of that information to give us a bit of a heads up around what we think some of that guidance might look like, and then us quickly do some work with our local public health teams and do some webinars like this, do some training or sharing sessions, if you like, just to try and get some of that information and work together, do some peer learning together to understand kind of what it is that we're all thinking and how we're doing that. So the first three things that we want to do is around how to open up community centres and buildings safely again, how to deliver activities in person safely again, and what that looks like in the context of social distancing. I'm not going to comment on how many metres, but that's social distancing as it currently is. Then the other two things that we think are really important is how to work safely online. So obviously we've all been doing quite a lot of online. Everybody in this room has probably been delivering some of their support and their services online, and just helping people with that and helping people think about what they might need in terms of additional equipment to enable your groups or organisations to do that. And then the last thing, which I think is really, really important, is what is our role in the sector in test and contact tracing. So, you know, we've heard quite a bit in the media over the last couple of weeks about this, and we've been doing some work locally with Katrina, who's the Director of Public Health, and with our local team here in Oldham. But I am advocating for and lobbying for significant involvement from yourselves, from the voluntary community sector, in our local test and contact tracing, because I genuinely feel like for this to work, there's a huge, significant part of this to work is around key messaging being delivered by trusted people with relationships in communities. You know, and we firmly believe at Action Together, the community voluntary sector are those people who have those relationships. So I'm really pushing for a significant role for the sector in that. I'm pushing for a significant role from some of our community anchor organisations, some of our community buildings and spaces, to be the places where people can go walk locally in their community to be able to get a test done. And then for some of the advice and support, if they get a positive test, to be delivered from some of those our trusted community leaders, our trusted community people with those relationships, you know, and that is being well received locally in Oldham, and that work with our public health team, you know, is progressing really well. I've had a national call this morning on some of that, and, you know, the role of our sector in that is absolutely being viewed as up front and centre locally. So those are kind of the first three things that I think are the current really important three things that we're going to be doing some work on. If I can just really briefly touch on some of the homelessness work and the work with people who are in absolute crisis. So I think if we think about people with complex disadvantage, so a number of disadvantages, I think what's happened through particularly the Everybody In stuff, Jean, has meant that, you know, for the first time in a very long time, we have had a very, very, very small number of rough sleepers, if any rough sleepers in Oldham. And I think there's an opportunity for us now to work together to ensure that we don't end up getting back to a situation where we have people rough sleeping. So how do we then, what I'm advocating for, what I'm trying to lobby for, is that we work together within what is a really, really complex and challenging system, as we all know, but we work together to ensure that the support is there for people through the sector, but actually in some of those some of the broader systems like the housing system or the justice system, or the substance misuse system, that we connect better those bits of the system to make sure that we're supporting people to stay away from rough sleeping and some of the other things that have such an impact on people's lives. Because I think there's a real opportunity now for us to do things differently, but the time is now for us to do that.
Thank you, Laura. Deborah?
Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to comment on a couple of the points. First of all, around when is it going to be, and I think it was Rebecca who raised this, when is it going to be safe to reopen? And I think obviously we'll wait for the evidence and so on, but the Northwest we know has a higher rate of infectivity, if I can put it like that, so the transmission of the virus, than anywhere else in the country apart from the Southwest, that also has an R rate of more than 1. So we need to be very careful. We mustn't forget we've had 235 people who've died across Oldham. So it's important that we make sure that the virus is receding, the infection is not spreading, and that's going to drive really in terms of when we go to the next phase. It's important that we recognise that. The other point I wanted to say was about PPE. Again, I think that the NHS, in collaboration with the voluntary sector, have been absolutely fantastic about what they've done to try and make PPE available, and doing it so quickly. I know when I've been volunteering and doing the food deliveries, I've had access to masks and to gloves. So that's really, to their credit. We must look at why we didn't have it in the first place. You'll have heard on the news about Operation Cygnus back in 2016, which highlighted the shortage of PPE. And after the event locally, we've done a lot to make sure that it is available and more widely available. But why were we there in the first place?
Great, thank you, Deborah. So I've got another batch of 3 questions. There's been quite a lot of exchanges in the chat group, and I would encourage people to have a look at the exchange there. There's some really good advice and signposting there. It may well be that some of it are slightly overtaken how I've recorded interest in speaking. So if I've got you down and you think your question has been answered or addressed in the chat, then that's fine as well. But I've got Javid Raymond, I've got Jem, and then Kulzam, and then we'll move on to the next batch of questions. So Javid, please.
Yeah, good morning. I did send the question in, but to be honest with you, I forgot what I wrote down, so I'm just going to quickly check my emails.
I do that every day.
Because I'm in so many meetings, I just forget.
Is it helpful, Javid, if I just kind of summarise? If
you would, please.
Yeah, because I think it's a really important point you've raised about the cultural inequalities, the risk rate amongst our BAME communities in particular, and just how we target and offer support. And I know for myself and Debbie, it's been a huge focus of attention, and we've raised it with the council about how we then respond. But I mean, there's quite a lot of that, Javid, that's around. It's complex. Some of it might be genetics, but let's be honest, a lot of it is our social issues. It's about overcrowding. It's about multi-generational households. It's about working in higher risk occupations where contact with the general public is more exposed. If you look at the ONS data on occupational death rates through COVID, taxi drivers feature the highest in the country for death rates through COVID. And of course, that's a large part of our employment here in Oldham and the rest of that kind of customer facing activity. I think there's quite a lot though about how the council in particular focuses on how do you get to the people who are most at risk to make sure that they're prioritised for testing and tracing, because actually beyond BAME communities, we've also got a large section of our population, white BAME and the rest of it, who work in warehousing and distribution, who have been at risk through social distancing not being adhered to in the workplace for the best part of 2 months plus. So Javid, do you come in and add any gaps that I've left?
The only gap that I would like to add to is in regards to as so in this, the South Asian communities, people think Pakistani, but there's two distinct communities. There's Pakistani and a large Kashmiri community in Oldham, which doesn't get recognised because they have a different language and they have different cultural values. I could send you a copy of a report that was submitted at Rochdale Council for them to consider, but it shows that the Kashmiri community face significantly more inequalities than the normal Pakistani communities do.
Okay, thank you, David. I think to be fair, most people on the call would accept that the vast majority of our Pakistani community are Kashmiris. And so I think we do differentiate, but you're right, if we need to kind of tailor support around that understanding, then we'll do that. I'm going to ask Jem to come in, and then Kuzam. I'm going to ask Rebecca and Laura to answer the questions in the round, and then we're going to move on to Lucy, Majid, and so Jem.
Yeah, sorry, it seems a little bit off topic somewhat now, but I just mentioned in the comments there, because I have to pop off in a minute, we're predominantly based in Tameside, although we do offer support to anybody across Greater Manchester. We don't really have any kind of criteria for help. So I'll send an email to Laura, who hopefully will be able to pass our details on. Some of the services we're offering at the moment is online and remote support, counselling. We're accepting new referrals for counselling over the phone now, or over Skype, whatever the preferred method of communication is by the client. And a kind of befriending service, I suppose, welfare checks, mostly we're targeting people who are isolated, those who are asylum seekers, refugees, people with no recourse to public funds, who maybe being housed adequately at the moment, maybe okay, but are not having that one-to-one chat, people checking in, and even if all the basic needs to be met, just somebody to check on it and to say we're here for you should you need anything else. So we've been really fortunate in recruiting volunteers for that, and we have quite a number of volunteers who speak a whole array of different languages. So I'll obviously, we're more than happy to extend that service to Oldham residents as well. So like I said, I will pass my details to Laura, and hopefully we'll be able to touch base with some of your organisations moving forward.
That's great, thank you, Jem. There's been loads of offers of support, help, guidance in the chat feature. I don't know if Jack could maybe download the chat and circulate it afterwards. I think that'd be really helpful. Kuzam, do you want
yes,
to?
yes, that's myself. Thank you. I think my question may have actually been answered by Rebecca, just can answer before. It was just really the fact that the project has been seeing a really great increase in referrals from those, particularly from the BAME community, and we've been supporting and just capturing that data, really, that intelligence, and how it could be moved forward and fed into the recovery strategy that you were talking about, Jim. But I think Rebecca has actually mentioned that with tomorrow's kind of forum and other kind of avenues. But just wanted to ask how will this data, or how will the intelligence that our project and by the sound of listening to Jared and other people on the platform, how will that be taken forward and fed into to influence the way that it needs to be working?
Great. Rebecca, before you respond to that, could I just add in as well, it's a similar theme really, which is how do you use that local intelligence to make sure that we get to the people who need support most? Yeah. And it strikes me as we begin to test, track and trace, that actually the community organisations are pretty essential to making sure that we have an effective kind of tracing regime in place. I'll bring Rebecca in, and then Laura.
Thank you.
Yeah. So first thing to say is that in terms of for those that aren't aware of the kind of different data sets that we're working to, we've had information shared with us by the government, which tells us who of the population in Oldham is required to be on the shielding list, so the clinically most vulnerable, which is about 10,000 people in Oldham. And then we also have had people that have proactively contacted the helpline because they are in need, whether that's because they're needing to self-isolate or that they're in need for other reasons, and that's often to do with the fact that they're in economic distress and suffering from poverty. What we've done in Oldham is we've got something called the Thriving Communities Index, which divides Oldham into 115 areas. And we've used the understanding that we've got of Oldham and our population, and where we think we've got places where people are in particular need, but also we've got a really rich understanding of the demography of that population. And we've overlaid that index on the shielded list and over the contacts with the helpline to see where there are gaps in contact with the helpline and where we think people aren't making use of that service that is available to them. And then we've done some targeted communication with people that live in those areas, whether that be through local elected members or through other communication, to really make sure that the people that most need it are getting that support. And that has seen, when we've rerun the data, that there's been an evening out. So we know that that's working to an extent, but we can never ever rest on our laurels in that regard. I've got an echo. I don't know if people have come off mute, but I'm bouncing back at myself. And then we are also targeting that support in terms of making sure that all the messaging is available in different languages. We've worked through local community groups to also communicate in that manner. People will be aware that we've also written to all of the over 70s that live in the borough that we've got details of in order to encourage people to access the support through the helpline. So we've put an enormous amount of effort into making sure that we're targeting that offer of support for people who are vulnerable as far as we're able. We're also encouraging all of you to use the networks that you've got. So if you or the people you work with are aware of people that you consider to be vulnerable that haven't accessed support, you can also access the helpline in order to point us in that direction. In terms of that kind of insight around the impact, if there's information that you have got that we've not got ready access to yet that can help inform that insight, I'd be really keen for that to be shared with us, so that can be fed into the community hubs in order to kind of focus that activity going forward. But absolutely, the reason we are doing that analysis is in order that we can focus all of our activity based on as rich an understanding of the needs of our population as possible, so that we're targeting support rather than applying that in a kind of blanket way. And then finally, just to comment, whilst I am not the Director of Public Health and by no means an expert on testing, tracking and tracing, in terms of the approach that we are taking in Oldham, we are absolutely looking at those places, so those settings, whether that be care homes, whether that is our places of work, so that in the way that we roll out the testing and tracking across Oldham, we do that in a way that is in accordance with the needs of our population. So that isn't purely from a Southeast Asian point of view, and the points that were made there about the segmenting of the population in that regard are important, that we do absolutely, that we take it into account. But also the understanding that is emerging in Oldham is, I think, as Jim and Debbie have both said, that it is as much about deprivation, the places that people work, the occupations that they have. So we need to make sure that we are basing what we do and the way we prioritise that activity on that understanding of vulnerability in population. That is absolutely the approach that we are taking, that we're not doing it evenly everywhere. We're taking a kind of what Katrina, who's the Director of Public Health, would describe as a population health management approach. So based upon the insight that we've got about where the places that are most vulnerable.
Laura?
Thanks, Jim and Rebecca. I mean, I think just to build on what Rebecca has just said there around kind of the insight from that equalities work and the group that's meeting tomorrow, you know, I think it's absolutely critical that we understand the insight, but then what's really important is that we then work together to invest in and deliver the joint solutions. So it's, you know, similar answer, I guess, to the test and contact tracing, is that, you know, this stuff works because people have trust and relationships with community organisations and with community leaders. And I think what what's been demonstrated and proven, I guess, through the last few months is how important those relationships are, particularly for reaching, some of, I hate the words vulnerable and hard to reach, but, in some of the groups that are the most disadvantaged, I guess, the role for the voluntary sector in reaching and supporting those people, those residents in Oldham, has been more clearly demonstrated than it ever could have, I guess, in this time. So equally with the equalities impact work, it's really important for us then to develop those joint solutions together. And we know that funding and investment is going to be incredibly difficult, more so than it ever was, and it wasn't easy before, was it? But I think it's about us absolutely working together to invest the money that is available to the places that can reach the people that we're trying to help. And that is what the work is about for me. And equally, Rebecca, with the test and trace stuff, what's been really clear for Oldham in developing a local programme of test and contact tracing and what that looks like, what's been really, really clear is that the role of the voluntary sector is critical to that.
Yeah.
But also that it's invested to do that. And locally, Katrina and Carolyn have been talking to members of the Department for Health about what investment potentially is available to do that, and very much around making sure that the sector is supported to do that.
Could I just come in there briefly? Sorry, I had that on my list of things I was going to mention, and remiss of me, I should have done, is that Oldham are going to be a part of a national pilot looking at how the approach to testing, tracking and tracing can be community-led, with the voluntary sector absolutely working in partnership with us. It actually was the central point that I should have made first. So we have volunteered to be part of that national pilot, so that it's a community-led approach rather than one that's kind of top down from the NHS. And that is a really positive thing that in Oldham we're going to be part of leading some of that work.
Great, that's extremely encouraging. So we've got 30-ish minutes left on the call.
Can I come in, Jim?
Yeah, of course.
so sorry.
Batches of 3 questions each.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll quickly follow on from what everybody said. Inequalities is one of the reasons I became an MP. So former public health consultant who focused on inequalities. So everything that's been said about this is absolutely right. People are likely to die, twice as likely to die from COVID if they are poor, and they're also twice as likely to die if they're from a BAME background. And these are the stark realities. The structural racism across our society is still here. And the Oldham Fairness Commission, which I convened and chaired, and you can go on my website to see the report, we still need to do more on that. We really do. So there's, recognize everything that people have said. Now's the opportunity, because there is so much public outrage about as Laura said so accurately, it's shone a spotlight on these inequalities, and also in terms of how they've been exacerbated by COVID. But they've always been there. They've always been there, and we all need to double our efforts around this. On the testing, tracking and tracing stuff, I mean, that is absolutely fantastic that it's going to be community led. From my perspective, as I say, as a former public health consultant, that needs to be fully in place before we can reliably say that we can extend the lifting of the lockdown, because it means that anybody that's identified with COVID can then be isolated and the infection can be contained. That's absolutely key. On the other thing about that's mentioned in the chat about isolation, I just wanted to mention the fantastic idea around the street groups on that and providing some support. I also chair the all-party group for dementia. It's been raised as a real issue, and 40% of people who have died in care homes have dementia. So these are really, again, important points to make. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Debbie. So I've got Lucy, Majid and Diane. Lucy?
Yeah, my question was just around the wider communications as we go forward into the recovery. So as lockdown restrictions start to ease, some of our teams will be remobilised and we'll be seen to be more active within the communities. So just wondering whether there's any borough-wide plans for communication to support the sector to carry out the work safely for both teams and both people that we work with, so that we can do so without the pressures of being seen to breaking lockdown rules. So for example, we're already seeing that young people coming out to meet some of our youth workers in public spaces are already starting to be stigmatised around breaking lockdown rules. So it's just around what support as a borough that we can have for the sector in terms to enable us to do our roles and safely.
I think that's a really good point, Lucy. Majid?
Yeah, okay. Mine was more a comment than a question, and I think it has been answered, but I'll just say what I was going to say. I think, once again, the voluntary and faith sector have demonstrated a huge amount of capability and capacity they've got to help out, particularly during these very difficult times. And we've seen example after example of them finding and filling those gaps that were exposed by COVID. But in terms of sustainability and going forward, the sector needs to be very much co-designing and delivering services, and not seen as an afterthought, or once something's been designed and thought about and then say, well, can you do this little bit? So it really, that needs to be mainstream. So it's happening in parts, to be fair, but it's not consistent and stuff. And sometimes what happens is bits of money and bits of projects are funded, and what happens is a huge amount of effort is put in, but there's a stop-start, so it raises expectations, and then it stops again, and then people get frustrated again, and they've got to move towards sustainability and looking at things for the long term and stuff. But that is only really going to happen if these groups are there right at the beginning, when the ideas are being conceived and stuff, and not when things are sort of decided and say, well, what do you think about this and what do you think about the other?
Great, thank you. Diane?
Hi everybody, Diane here from Inspire Women. It was more of a comment and following on from Colsam really around hearing women's voices and how do we feed the actual kind of women's voices into this process. I think, Rebecca, you've answered it in one of your last bits when you were talking around getting the data in, and maybe Laura, it's something we think about around the women's network, so that we're actually feeding the real experiences in when women don't want to present themselves. How do we make sure that they're not being missed through the whole relationship building and that impact? So thank you. I don't think it's a question necessarily, but an observation that we need to use this forum to do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. I mean, obviously we've all, I think, had concerns about how children not going to school, not going to community groups has had an impact on the number of child safeguarding referrals, where the usual lines of communication and pickup of issues hasn't been taking place. I think we all share the concerns about how the lockdown pressure of people living in confined spaces, but also the economic pressure that's being placed on families, is causing a huge amount of stress in families being able to keep together safely. So it's a real concern there. So I'm going to ask Rebecca to come in, and Lucy, and then we've got our final batch of questions to come. Rebecca.
So just to respond to Lucy, first of all, I think you make a really good point. So we've invested a lot as a kind of Team Oldham kind of system in our communications, in terms of communication out to elected members, to key stakeholders in the community, to the public. But that particular point that you address in terms of managing public expectations, particularly in relation to young people, and what it is reasonable and legitimate for them to do, it is not something we've directly considered. So I'll take that away. I think it's a good point, particularly because people are anxious, and kind of separating out when people are in breach of those rules around social distancing and when they're not is you know, it's a useful observation. Really, just in terms of Madge's and Diane's point, really, I agree with the sentiments that you are expressing. That point around kind of co-production right from the off, so in the development of policy design and not just in delivery in pockets. I do agree with that, and you know, certainly I think we are committed to adopting that approach. Won't always get it right, and we do have the challenging around the funding following that commitment. So I think that the commitment, without question, is there. It is very challenging to sometimes follow through with the funding that follows that commitment, and we do have to work as hard all the time to drawing funding into the borough, to work together to make sure we are identifying every opportunity to unlock funding to support the sector, and that is not always straightforward, but that commitment is certainly there. And similarly, that point about engagement and bringing in the voices of all groups, we've already, I think, done some really positive work in that regard, but that there is more that we can do. And one of the conversations I do want to have tomorrow is how can we broaden our engagement with people across the borough at this time where we can't have a large community conversation in a place. We've got to do that virtually or by more innovative means, and I'm keen really to kind of hear some ideas about that. I know in other places they have successfully done really quite large kind of engagement conversations using social, using this kind of forum. But that is something that, as we move now into this being a kind of more long-term state of affairs, we do need to focus on and have a clear plan to make sure that the experience of transition to recovery across the borough is understood.
Thank you, Rebecca. Laura?
Thanks, Jim. I think in all that, probably just want to pick up on this kind of sustainability question and the challenges of the funding question. I guess what we've seen, and if we have an opportunity, I guess now to think about how we might lobby government and nationally around what is needed. I think, we absolutely welcomed the announcements around the emergency response funding. But equally, we know that it wasn't enough. And the next bit is that funding announcement and funding that it brought with it 6 months worth of ability to fund COVID response projects, with a little bit of flexibility through the national lottery bit of the funding around liquidity, but nowhere near what is going to be needed for the longer term. So I think if we've an opportunity to give a message from the sector locally, I think it's that we need to be thinking kind of nationally about what funding looks like for the voluntary sector through this transition period and into next year, because I'm really afraid and nervous about what the sector and the resilience of the sector and what some of our key community organisations, that their position will be in 12 months' time. I think the Great Manchester Leadership Group wrote to our Chancellor of the Exchequer earlier this month, kind of outlining 3 key asks. In some of the insight in one of the asks, which was specifically around that resilience funding, is that across Greater Manchester, we think that 9 out of 10 BAME organisations have no reserves. And therefore, within sort of 3 or 4 months' time, unless we get some support around that resilience sustainability funding, potentially there'll only be 1 in 10 BAME organisations left across Greater Manchester. I mean, that's not necessarily Oldham, but I think we can extrapolate some of that for what that would look like locally. So yeah, I think a key concern and a key piece of work for us to do now together is to think about what does the resilience bit look like for the voluntary sector going forward the next 3 months, the next 6 months, the next 12 months. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura. We've got 4 questions to get in. Rose has asked a question at the end that I am going to bring in because it's an important question. And what we'll do is, as Rebecca, Laura, Debbie feed back, we'll ask you to include your concluding remarks as well, and then we'll hopefully bring the meeting together there or thereabouts on time. So I've got I'm going to take these in one batch. So I've got Abid Hussain, Mohammed, Nazim, and then Rose. So Abid, are you on the call?
Hi Jim, can you hear me?
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, my question was really around the voluntary organisations. We're all doing fantastic work out in the community. I would like to see some of the elected members and obviously our MPs to visit the organisation. And I know there's social distancing in place, but you get to see really what work goes on behind the scenes. It's fantastic. We share our information on Twitter and Facebook pages and everything. I think it'd be a great idea for Action Oldham staff. I know they've been doing work in different areas with district managers, which I've had a conversation with a few of them before. But I think for me really is that the council staff visit out in the communities and get to know the groups and also get to know the places where they're based. And just wanted to get some views of Rebecca and Laura, really.
Great. I mean, I think on that, just before because it's, I think all of us want to show support and solidarity and come and celebrate where we see people are doing fantastic work. And there are plenty of opportunities in Oldham to do that just because of how much we're all doing. I think from a personal point of view, and everyone will have their own kind of view on this, I've taken a really blunt approach to lockdown, which is that unless something is absolutely essential, like going out to get food or being forced to trek down to London because I'm on the front bench, I've taken the view that otherwise I'm just going to be at home and not risk spreading it, if I'm honest. Even to the point where my grandma passed away in August, and when I seen my dad at the cemetery on her birthday, I turned round and went back home because I didn't want to risk spreading a potential virus to him. So I've taken quite a black and white view about it, if I'm honest. Also recognising that travelling 200 miles to London means that I might be placing people at more risk if I then go out into the community in Oldham after coming into London. So I think as we begin to ease lockdown, I think we need to kind of wrap up that wider celebration of the community effort. And I'd be more than happy to play my part in that. But yeah, so just I thought it'd be useful to kind of outline my personal position on that. If I ask Mohammed to come in next, and then we'll take Nazim and Rose.
Good afternoon, all. I think the question I had was more to do with collaborative working. I'm a volunteer over at the Greengate Trust since the COVID-19's happened. And one thing that we always struggle with is knowing what everybody else is doing. Because we're finding that a lot of organisations are either working in the same areas, in a sort of like a parallel universe style where we probably see a van going by or a person going by, but we don't talk to each other or don't say hello or anything, and we don't know what we're doing. Especially with the skill sets as well, because I think every organisation's got its own unique skill sets that we could probably utilise on a networking front. I think for the Greengate Trust, we find that we get a lot of people coming in from the Eldon precinct, that area, where they have issues apart from the COVID stuff, the food stuff. It's other issues as well, and other items that they need help with, and then we struggle as to where we direct them to. I know I've sent Laura a text before, and she's directed me to somebody, so that's going to help hopefully. We're using Oldham Council as well. We've got Zane, Suzanne and Linda. I do tap on them a lot and put a lot their way as well. But what I'd like to know is, do we have any kind of list, or can we set something up where we can do any collaborative working so we can use each of the skill sets on a borough-wide basis rather than keeping it to on a macro or local level? So that's what I'd like to know about, really, please.
Great, thank you for that. Nazim?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, I think everybody's covered pretty much everything that I wanted to say, but I just want to reiterate, first of all, more of these kind of meetings need to be happening. I think more needs to be convened. Sharing information across multi agencies is always a good thing. Also, something that somebody touched on before, I think the gentleman just before me just mentioned about database of maybe a database of organisations and services that they offer that cover all the different areas, all the different caveats that all these great organisations are doing. But to collaborate, I mean, we all talk about collaboration. We're all echoing loudly and clearly that we need to collaborate. But this database was talked about some years ago. And I think now, if we're not going to do it now, when are we going to do it? So something needs to be done about that. And then, yeah, the support Action Together are providing and the other organisations provide is unprecedented, and it's really good. And we're very, very proud to be part of that Oldham community. And more needs to be done. But in terms of collaboration, I think some of the vital things that somebody mentioned before about duplication of work. Now, the duplication of work only exists there because there isn't that database, and that database I think is going to be vital to move forward. And yes, small pots of money. Laura's already on it. I know, Victoria's on it. You guys are all working on that. Small pots of money for organisations, and I think that will keep things going. One of the things that some of my trustees mentioned to me and some of my volunteers at UKEF is that we need some sort of parking permits or something to be able to, when we're going into the town centre, picking up food items, essentials for service users, parking permits might be a good one where we can, use that to park the cars anywhere. I know at the moment there's a restriction, but I believe that this restriction's been lifted anyway, as parking meters are back in force. So maybe something that we can look at. And we're not talking massive amounts of money, but at least it'll get things going. So there's 2 or 3 things: more of these meetings, a database, and some sort of for key workers, parking permits for key workers, so that they can float around easily to get the essential services to the people that need it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Rose?
Just want to thank everyone for this meeting, because I've worked in Oldham for a long time. I run a charity called Support and Action for Women's Network, and I've got two things to comment. The first one is just want for us to go and deliberate on undocumented people, because I know collectively we are working a lot around supporting people with no recourse to public funds, but they're undocumented people, and this includes people who have been on visas which have expired, people who can't afford to renew their visas because of the way things are, and these people have children who are suffering and not on anybody's radar, but also it's escalating abuse, because the need for all services around female genital mutilation are increasing. So we need to deliberate on that category of people who are not being captured by anyone. And just to capture what Nassim said, I just want to say a big thank you to Action Together for supporting us to keep afloat. And to resonate what Laura said, we are a small BME organization that's been around, and we work on we make small money go so far. And at the moment, since the lockdown, we've been receiving referrals, and every day at least 3 or 4, and weekly about 10. And these are requests from local authority, requests from housing associations for furniture, and it ranges from a kettle to a full house. And all I'm saying is that we applied for a small business grant, and we've never had anything from it. And I think that's something, because you can't call and find out what's going on. So I think we need support, like Laura said. If that sort of money can go into supporting us small organizations to stay afloat.
Great, thank you for that, Rose. If I ask Rebecca to come in, Laura, I'll come in with my concluding remarks, and I'll ask Debbie to wind up the session with her concluding remarks as well. Rebecca?
Okay, so just a couple of things from me then. So the point about visiting the voluntary sector and seeing the work, clearly we're in unusual times where that is very difficult to do. But as a general point, I completely agree. There is absolutely no replacement for seeing what the sector are doing in reality. Going back pre-COVID, we had weekly event, which was about standing in people's shoes and shadowing the work of the voluntary sector, which I know many of the kind of leaders across the health system and elsewhere found incredibly useful, and I think really did help shift the mindset of people around the value of the voluntary sector in Oldham. And I think once we need to carry on with a commitment to do that. The parking point that Nazim raised, that's something we can certainly look at. So I'll take that away as an action. I'd be keen to kind of explore the point about undocumented people and in terms of that experience, because I know that we've done a lot working in partnership to kind of work through the response to people with no recourse to public funds. But you appear to be highlighting something different there, where I think that probably warrants a more detailed conversation. In terms of the approach that we've been taking so far since we've gone into lockdown, in terms of making sure that support is available, in terms of housing support, other practical support, whether that be provided by statutory agencies or by the voluntary sector, that has been something that's been made available regardless of people's status as far as we are able. Clearly, as we transition back into normality, there is some work to do there. But again, I think I'll trigger a kind of more detailed conversation there, because that's something that's probably merits a longer conversation than we're able to have there. In terms of my kind of just closing comments that Jim asked, really, it's just to restate, as I said at the outset, the desire to kind of absolutely work in partnership with the voluntary community, faith and social enterprise sector as equal partners in all elements of decision making and delivery. Where it is possible, as a council, we will provide financial support, but absolutely work together to unpick those financial challenges, but also providing support in kind. One of the things we have been able to do throughout the impact of COVID-19 is use some of our workforce who perhaps are not working in their normal jobs at the moment, to help with coordination of volunteers and other practical support, and that will and can continue. So I think the final thing I want to say is that, as Laura's really highlighted, is that we've also got a really important role, and Carolyn as chief exec has been very much involved in these conversations in terms of making sure that when we think about the infrastructure that is required to respond to the impact of COVID-19 as we transition into recovery, that the government investment in social as well as physical infrastructure is absolutely critical. So as well as the voluntary sector voice and the voice of MPs, as chief executives and as council, that we do have a really important voice in making sure that government are aware of the importance of that investment going forward, and just be reassured that that is something that Carolyn is doing, and doing so repeatedly and consistently when she has the opportunity to do that.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Laura?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Jim. Just to add on some of the questions, and then I'll just do a really quick summary conclusion from myself. The database, Nazim, we've got the community activities directory that we've been building for the last sort of 12 months. So there's around 1,800, 2,000 different community activities on there. Unfortunately, as of about the 16th of March this year, the majority of those activities are no longer running. They're currently paused. And then there's been this amazing chunk of new response activity. We've not managed yet to put that together and put that out in the public domain, but it's a job that I think Victoria, member of my team's on the call, it's a job that my team are well aware of we need to do. We need to figure out how we do that, because I think you're absolutely right, it's a critical piece of work. So I'm going to take that away, thank you. I'm also hearing from you, and I think it was Mohammed Awas from you, around kind of collaboration is really important, and more so at this time, and those spaces to collaborate in the sector are really, really important. We've got some plans around how we can do that. So some of the networks that we used to run in the old world, like community explorers, you know, there's plans in train for how we do those more online. But equally, I'm really keen to work with everybody here to understand kind of what is it that you need from that and how can we best do that together. So please contact me outside of here and with any things that you need. And particularly, I guess, thinking about this next 3 to 6 months and what you think the needs are from yourselves, from organisations like yourselves, and that you think where action together isn't getting it right or could do more of something that would help you. I'm really, really keen to hear that, to make sure that, you know, all our energy is put in the right place and has the best impact for you, really. So I guess the last 2 things I want to say then is collaboration and working together is critically important for us now going forward. We want to create those spaces to be able to do that. I'm not going to mention funding again, other than to say it is that kind of longer term beyond the response funding. I like how you looked up there, Rebecca. Beyond that, beyond the response funding. So how are we going to ensure that our key community anchor organisations and our key community organisations are here in the next 6 months, the next 12 months? And then the last one is a bit of a plea from myself. So every 3 years we work with our partners across 10GM to do a huge piece of research called State of the Sector, which does a huge piece of research looking at the voluntary community sector across all the 10 places across GM. We are, this year was to be the year of the State of the Sector, and at first we thought we can't possibly do that big piece of research, there's so much going on, but actually we feel that now is the time to do that, because I think to capture some of the response and some of the potential concerns as we move forward to living with COVID phase is going to be critically important. So in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be launching the 2020 State of the Sector survey. And if I can just as a plea, ask people to please engage with that process, please fill that in. Let us know if you need support, we can help you to do it. But it's really critical information that helps us to do the lobbying, helps us to understand some of your needs so that we can work better together. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura. I think for me, I've found this crisis extremely difficult emotionally. Not just because we're all struggling with lockdown and not seeing our family and people that we care about physically. Zoom is okay, but it's no replacement for kind of human interaction, you know, meeting in the pub, seeing friends and family and the rest of it. But there's no doubt that it's brought out the best of the community. You know, there is something about a crisis where people really rally around and they respond in such an impressive way. And I think individually we can all play our part, but actually having an established voluntary sector group that can be sustained is really important in that as well, to act as kind of the magnet or the glue to hold it together. I think, and Debbie will feel this, from an Oldham point of view, the thing that I've struggled with most emotionally is seeing the individual impact that COVID has had on people that we care about. So the number of people that have lost their jobs or who were on agency contracts and were just told to go home one day without any support, people trying to battle with a benefit system and the 5-week wait for universal credit or changes to income levels, or people who are just suffering from, you know, kind of mental, emotional health issues who don't feel as though they've got support, and lockdown is just compounding the issues that were pre-existing. Or unfortunately, people who have lost loved ones and they weren't able to do the very human thing of holding the hand in the final hours to give them the support, or being able to say a final goodbye. And I think, you know, the emotional scars that COVID will leave, we need to make sure that we're there to support each other. Whether that's a second chance goodbye, whether it's about celebrating the lives of people that have lost. I hope that we are through the worst of it, but I fear we're not. And how we support each other collectively in that is going to be so important. What this has also highlighted, though, is what we all knew, which is that there are deep-rooted inequalities in our country that have made our town more vulnerable to COVID than it should have been. Whether that's about poverty and people's income levels, whether it's about overcrowding, whether it's people being forced to put food on the table or keep themselves and their family safe and isolate. People have been forced to make really difficult decisions in a way that they should not have to be. They didn't have the choice to work from home with a laptop. They were forced to go in to a workplace that they knew was unsafe. And as a result, they put themselves and the family at risk, and we need to address that. You know, we cannot keep on having the same circular conversations about that which we know to be wrong, and just accept that in time it might sort itself out. It won't. Unless we really address this and start demanding better together for Oldham, we're not going to make the progress that we need. And so I think the recovery bit of it is going to be really important. And myself and Debbie are going to be making the calls at a national level. I think the government will have to come forward with some kind of economic response. But to me, it's not building a new road. It's not building a bit of extra railway track. It's about supporting people to be able to thrive and go forward and not repeat the mistakes of the last 10 years where we think austerity is the approach that we should be taking, and hollowing out the economy is the approach that we should be taking. I'm actually quite angry, to be honest, about the way that this country has behaved over the last 10 years in accepting that that was ever going to be a way to have a fairer country at the end of it. But I've got to say, I fear that maybe the government hasn't learned the lessons of the last 10 years. And what I really worry about is at a time when people feel economically isolated and stressed, when people feel emotionally like they're at the edge, then people will look for somebody to blame. And my experience of the banking crisis is people in Oldham did not blame the bankers. They started to blame each other. And I really fear that in a response to what could be a real economic hit to our town, that we see divisions in our community get even worse. And we all need to guard against that, but also think about the practical steps we can bring to unite people and to create a sense of unity. You know, whatever our race, religion, background, life experience, we are all working people. And when working people come together, there's nothing that can beat us. But when we allowed ourselves to be divided, the cracks soon appear. And I think how we respond to what follows is going to be so important. And finally, Debbie, can I hand over to you to close the session, please?
Thank you so much, Jim, and I heartily agree with absolutely everything that you've said there. There will be challenges ahead, but I also believe that there are opportunities, and I think we have had nearly 50 people on this call, so it shows that Team Oldham, and that's again one of the big things that we can take from this pandemic, how we have all worked together, and some of the innovation that's come from the voluntary sector has been absolutely amazing. It shows what we can do. So can I also thank all the panelists, Rebecca and Laura, but as I say, everybody that's taken part. What we'll commit to do is to identify the sort of key points from today and make sure that that's released to everyone, and what we're going to do about them. So Jim's mentioned in terms of the issues, for example, around funding, and I absolutely agree. I think that lessons around austerity and the impact that that has had on our communities, Oldham has been particularly detrimentally affected. If we think about the funding of local government and the underfunding of the NHS and social care sector, we need to make sure that we are defending our communities, defending our services that we all know are going to be in real need. I think some of the other key points that I picked up on in terms, in addition to funding, are the issues, and Laura's addressed many of them in terms of what she's and what Action Together are already doing around training, and also in terms of some of the resources around PPE. Those are practical things that we can take away. I also wanted to mention some of the additional gaps that have been identified, or the change of the needs that you are identifying. So what Jean was saying about rough sleepers, what Rose was saying in terms of undocumented people, and again making sure that we are trying to provide the solutions to those groups of people as well. I mentioned the 237 people who've died in Oldham from this pandemic, and the human tragedy that is. And we must make sure that the opportunities that can be done, that have been identified, are built on, that we do build back better, and that all parts of our community benefit from that. Again, we've talked about the inequalities, and they are brought into sharp focus with this pandemic, and we must do all that we can to address them right across the board. Inequality is not just about poverty, it's about fairness. And some of the points that Jim made about how fear and how unfairness is used to divide communities, you know, we need to recognise and address. But thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to Jim's team for organising this, and you know, I'm really looking forward to working with you to, as I say, to build on the opportunities, but recognising the challenges that we have as well. Thank you.